Have you ever wondered what truly haunts a person in their final years of life? I'm not talking about illnesses, overdue bills, or even the physical fear of death. I'm speaking of something far more intimate, something that remains silently there for decades, but inevitably surfaces as we approach the end. Carl Jung called this the shadow. And according to him, if you don't confront it while you're still alive, it will not only make your departure more difficult, but it might also rob you of the peace you so deeply desire to find in your last breath. The shadow, for Jung, is not a mystical invention or a philosophical trick. It is a real and concrete part of our psyche, formed by everything we deny within ourselves. These are repressed feelings, unadmitted mistakes, desires we consider shameful, attitudes we regret, but prefer to hide even from ourselves. It builds up throughout our lives. And the curious thing is that the more we try to forget it, the more it grows. It's like sweeping dirt under the rug. At first it seems to work, but over time the volume increases to the point of deforming the floor. And here's the most unsettling point. Jung said that, in old age, the shadow can no longer be ignored. When the body begins to weaken and life's distractions diminish, our attention turns inward. It is in this silence that the shadow begins to approach. And if a person does not know it or has never tried to dialogue with it, this approach can be suffocating. Regret, guilt, and the feeling of having lived half-heartedly become constant visitors. Have you noticed how some elderly people become bitter, irritable, or withdrawn? Often it's not just because of physical pain, but because the shadow is knocking at the door, demanding to be heard. Perhaps you're thinking, "But I don't have anything that serious to hide." This is where many are mistaken. The shadow is not just made of great sins or crimes. It is also formed by abandoned dreams, by words we never had the courage to say, by parts of ourselves we deemed improper. A person may have led an honest life and still feel an enormous weight at the end, because they repressed their own authenticity to please others, and that, in the silence of old age, hurts more than any illness. Jung warned that in youth, we can survive without looking at this hidden part. Work, relationships, raising children, all of these serve as distractions. But as we age, these activities dissolve. Free time increases, and with it, the memory of everything that was left behind. It's as if the shadow knows there aren't many chapters left and therefore decides to present itself directly. And it doesn't knock softly. It brings with it memories you'd rather forget, feelings you thought were resolved, but aren't. The irony is that for Jung, confronting the shadow is not a punishment, it's an opportunity. He saw this encounter as life's last great mission. The shadow is in fact an honest mirror, perhaps the most honest you'll ever have, showing everything you tried to hide. And if you have the courage to look at that reflection and accept that it is part of you, you can experience a peace that few people know. The problem is that most people flee. Why do we flee? Because the shadow demands humility. It asks us to admit that we are not as perfect as we'd like to be, to acknowledge flaws that hurt other people, and that also hurt ourselves. It's uncomfortable, it's painful, but here's the secret. It is precisely this discomfort that cleanses the soul. It's like cleaning a wound. It stings at first, but that's the only way it can heal. Jung said that many deaths are accompanied not just by physical agony, but psychic agony. People spend their last days restless, mentally reliving past mistakes, wondering if they could have been better. And according to him, this happens because the shadow was ignored for too long. It arrives at the deathbed demanding to be recognized, and there's no more time to integrate it. That's why Jung considered working with the shadow so urgent, especially in maturity. It's not about luxury therapy, but a fundamental step towards dying in peace. Imagine for a moment, you on your last day lying in silence feeling there's nothing left to do, and instead of fear, a deep sense of relief, as if all the chapters of your life, even the darkest ones, were in their rightful place. No internal struggle, no emotional loose ends, just serenity. This isn't luck, this is the result of a conscious process that begins years before the end. And this process is the confrontation of the shadow. But what does confronting mean? Here we're not talking about fighting it or trying to destroy it. The shadow doesn't disappear. It needs to be recognized and integrated. It means looking at moments when we were selfish and saying, yes, that's also me. It means admitting that anger, envy, vanity, all of these are part of human nature, and that we are no exception. When we can see these parts without shame, we can also find something useful in them. Anger, for example, can be energy to fight for something just. Vanity can inspire us to take care of ourselves. To integrate is to transform what we hide into something that can strengthen us. And here's a point that might be unsettling. The older a person gets, the harder it is to pretend the shadow doesn't exist. Memory lapses, loneliness, shorter and more direct conversations with the outside world. All of this pushes the mind into a state of self-analysis. And if this self-analysis finds a life full of unresolved issues, the weight can be devastating. That's why Jung saw old age not as a decline, but as a moment of truth, the stage where there's no more time to lie to oneself. Many people wonder, but what if I don't have the strength to deal with everything that will appear? Jung's answer was direct. It is precisely in the act of confronting that we find strength. Courage doesn't come before. It is born during the process. And according to him, there is no too late moment to start. Even in the last years, it is possible to make peace with parts of oneself and feel relief. The question is, will you have the courage to start before you are forced to? And here we come to a crucial point that will guide our entire conversation. Jung was not just talking about confronting the shadow as an individual task. He saw it as a service to humanity. Because a person who dies in peace leaves an invisible but powerful legacy for everyone around them. Children, grandchildren, friends, everyone perceives, even unconsciously, that life was lived authentically. And this inspires, teaches, and transforms generations. But how do you take the first step? How do you recognize a shadow that we have spent our entire lives avoiding? And perhaps the answer is simpler and more uncomfortable than you imagine. To understand how to recognize your shadow, we must first accept that it does not present itself in obvious ways. It won't appear in the mirror, nor announce itself with a sign saying, "Here I am." The shadow reveals itself subtly, hidden in exaggerated reactions, old resentments, and the quick judgments we make of others. Jung said that often what we most condemn in the people around us is precisely what we deny in ourselves. It's as if, by pointing a finger outward, we are trying to divert attention from what exists within. Think of the situations that provoke disproportionate anger in you. Perhaps it's when you see someone showing off, or when someone acts lazy, or when someone makes a mistake you consider unforgivable. These intense reactions are clues. The shadow acts like a reflection. What you most reject out there is usually in some way dormant inside you. It doesn't mean you are the same as that person, but that there is a part of you that you refuse to accept. Another sign lies in the stories you avoid telling. We all have passages in life that we prefer not to mention, not because they are criminal or immoral, but because they expose us in a way that hurts the image we've built for ourselves. Perhaps it was a cowardly choice, a wasted opportunity, a love we didn't have the courage to live. We keep these stories deep in our memory as if they were forbidden chapters, but for Jung, that is precisely where the shadow hides. There are also the words that deeply bother us when someone directs them at us. Proud, selfish, cold, insecure. When one of these labels hurts us more than normal, it's because it touches a sensitive spot. And that sensitive spot, in the Jungian view, is almost always part of the shadow. It's as if it's knocking at the door and saying, "Look, this is also you and you don't want to admit it." Now you might be asking yourself, but why, after all, do we need to bring all this to light? Wouldn't it be easier to let the past lie? Jung's answer was clear, because what is repressed does not disappear. It only finds indirect ways to manifest. It's like a water leak inside the wall. You don't see it, but it's there, weakening the structure. And when you finally notice it, the damage is already extensive. The repressed shadow manifests in bursts of irritation, in unexplained sadness, in grudges that seem not to pass. For the elderly, this effect is even stronger. With fewer external activities, the mind often revisits memories. And if these memories are filled with unrecognized parts, the result is a constant state of restlessness. This is where what Jung called the work of integration comes in, a process of bringing these parts into consciousness, understanding them, and finding a place for them in the narrative of your life. The work begins with radical honesty, and this doesn't mean making a list of all the mistakes we've ever made. That would just be an exercise in guilt. It means looking at each chapter and asking, what was I trying to protect? What did I not want others to see? Often behind a mistake, there is a legitimate fear, a human desire for acceptance or security. Integrating the shadow is not about justifying, but understanding. A simple example: imagine a person who in youth gave up a great dream for fear of disappointing their family. They spend their life telling themselves it was the right choice, but deep down, they feel an emptiness. That emptiness is part of the shadow. Recognizing it doesn't mean abandoning the life they built, but accepting that this unsatisfied part exists, and that it is also you. When this acceptance happens, the weight of frustration diminishes. Jung believed that this process was especially valuable in old age because at that time the purpose of life changes. In youth we seek to build, in maturity we seek to understand, and in aging we seek to integrate. It's as if at the end of the road we want to ensure that all the pieces of the puzzle are in place, even those we tried to hide in the back of the drawer. One of the most powerful tools Jung suggested was inner dialogue. This might sound strange, but it literally means talking to your shadow, not dramatically, but like one talks to an old acquaintance. Asking, what do you want to show me? What have I not yet accepted about myself? It is an exercise that requires patience, because the shadow does not respond immediately. But over time, insights begin to emerge, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in sudden memories, sometimes in unexpected emotions in simple situations. And here's a warning: confronting the shadow is not a comfortable process. Often, it causes resistance. You might feel like giving up, like telling yourself that this is nonsense. But this resistance is, in fact, a sign that you are on the right path, because the shadow only offers discomfort when it is about to be revealed. It's like opening a window in a room that has been closed for decades. The first thing that comes in is dust and musty smell, but that's the only way the air starts to circulate. Perhaps you're thinking, all this seems like a lot of work, and I've lived so much already. That's true. But remember, it's not about fixing the past, but about making peace with it. And this is one of the greatest liberations one can experience. People who go through this process report a lightness they haven't felt in years. They say it's as if they can breathe deeper, sleep better, look at their own face in the mirror without looking away. Jung called this wholeness, the feeling of being complete, of not having to hide anything from oneself. And for him, this was the key to a peaceful death. Not the absence of physical pain, but the absence of internal struggle. When the shadow is integrated, the end ceases to be an enemy to be defeated and becomes merely the conclusion of a well-told story. But how do we keep this practice alive in daily life? The answer is surprisingly simple. Pay attention. Observe your own reactions, the memories that insist on returning, the feelings that arise without apparent reason. And, instead of pushing them away, draw closer to them. Write them down. Reflect. Ask yourself, what does this reveal about me? Over time, this habit becomes natural, and each time you integrate a small piece of your shadow, you feel the burden lighten. However, there's one last obstacle we need to discuss, one that prevents many people from taking this step. It's the fear that by confronting the shadow, they'll discover they are worse than they imagined. Jung was clear about this. It's exactly the opposite. The more you know your shadow, the more you realize it is not a monster but a wounded part of yourself, and that by embracing it, you don't become worse. You become more human, and this is where the conversation begins to deepen. Because, according to Jung, integrating the shadow is not just a psychological act but a spiritual one. It is a movement of reconciliation with oneself that opens space for a peace that goes beyond the mind. Now we will explore how this integration changes not only how we live, but also how we die, and why, for Jung, it is the true preparation for eternity. When Jung spoke about the integration of the shadow as preparation for eternity, he was not referring to specific religious dogmas. It didn't matter if the person believed in heaven, reincarnation, or simply the end of consciousness. For him, there was something universal. Death is the most profound transition we face, and how we approach it directly influences the experience. A mind burdened with unresolved conflicts tends to cling to life desperately, like trying to hold water in one's hands. A reconciled mind, however, bids farewell with the serenity of someone handing a book to its reader, knowing the story has been told to the very last necessary line. This reconciliation has a curious effect. It changes one's relationship with time. People who begin to confront their shadow realize they don't need to rush to make up for everything they didn't live. They no longer feel that anxious urgency of making up for lost time. This is because by integrating the past, the present ceases to be a battleground. It becomes a safe place where it's possible to simply be. This peace with the present is the greatest gift we can give ourselves before departing. But there's a subtle trap that must be avoided. Many people, when starting this process, try to become perfect as a way to compensate for past mistakes. This is a deception. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean erasing what happened or living the rest of one's life as an impeccable example of virtue. Rather, it means accepting that imperfection is part of our humanity. The danger of seeking perfection is that it merely becomes another mask, and every mask we carry silently feeds the shadow. Jung believed that old age was the most opportune time to remove these masks. It's the stage where others' opinions lose their power, where goals of status or material gain no longer hold the same weight. And precisely for this reason, it is the ideal moment for an act of courage to show oneself completely. This might mean having difficult conversations with family members, telling stories you never had the courage to share, or even asking for forgiveness, not necessarily to be forgiven, but to free yourself from the burden of having hidden. And here lies one of the deepest points of Jungian thought. The integration of the shadow is an act of self-love, but also a gift to others. Because when someone dies in peace, they leave behind a trail of reconciliation that spreads throughout the family and community. Think of the opposite. How many families are marked by unresolved grudges? How many children carry for decades the pain of a last conversation filled with resentment? Integrating the shadow isn't just about ensuring your own peace. It's about preventing your silence from becoming a wound for those who remain. Some people resist this idea because they believe digging up the past will open wounds. And yes, it does. But there's a crucial difference between opening a wound to bleed and opening it to clean. When we avoid touching it, the emotional infection continues to grow invisibly. By confronting it, we can stop the bleeding, treat it, and finally close it. Jung insisted that the pain of confronting is temporary, but the pain of avoiding is eternal. One of the most practical ways to begin this cleansing is to consciously revisit your life story. This can be done by writing memoirs, recording testimonies, or simply recounting your journey to a trusted person. But the secret lies in not just telling the victories and good times. It's also about including the mistakes, fears, and weaknesses, not to blame yourself, but to clearly see the entire narrative. Often, when you tell something you've held onto for decades, you realize that the weight you carried didn't match reality, and that realization brings liberation. Jung also spoke extensively about the role of dreams in the integration of the shadow. He saw dreams as messages from the unconscious, bringing to the surface aspects that the conscious mind insists on ignoring. A recurring dream of being lost, for example, might indicate that a part of you feels disconnected from your own identity. A dream of reuniting with someone from the past could be an invitation to revisit unresolved emotions. For him, paying attention to dreams and reflecting on what they might be trying to show was one of the most powerful tools for initiating this internal dialogue. Another fundamental point Jung emphasized is that the shadow is not composed only of negative aspects. Often it contains talents, passions, and potentialities that we repressed out of fear or social convention. A person who always wanted to paint but never allowed themselves might discover that part of their shadow is, in fact, a suffocated artist. Integrating this side means giving yourself the chance to live something that was kept hidden for decades. And no matter how late it seems, this experience can bring unexpected joy in the final years. This rediscovery of lost parts of oneself transforms aging. It ceases to be just a countdown and becomes a time of harvest, not of external things but of soul pieces that were scattered along the way. And in this sense, integrating the shadow is not just preparing to die, but also preparing to live better while one is alive. However, Jung warned that this process requires patience. The shadow does not reveal itself entirely at once. It shows itself in layers, and each layer requires time to be understood and accepted. It is a work that is done gradually without haste, and it is precisely this slowness that makes the process so powerful, because with each step, you not only understand more about yourself, you reconcile with your own past and build a more authentic present. There is, however, a moment in the process that Jung described as decisive, the instant when you look at something from your shadow and for the first time can say, "This is also me," without anger, shame, or denial. This moment is like an internal click. It's as if two pieces that had been separated for years finally fit together, and from then on, the energy that was once spent hiding that part becomes available to live more fully, and it is this released energy that changes how we face the end. Because contrary to popular belief, dying well is not a matter of having lived a perfect life, but of having lived a whole life, with all imperfections accepted. Jung believed that death, in this case, ceases to be a wall and becomes a door, and passing through a door is much easier than hitting a wall. Jung believed that the last great act of life is not physical, but psychological. He said that dying in peace is, to a large extent, the result of internal work that culminates in a final agreement with one's own existence. This agreement involves looking back and seeing not a sequence of isolated successes and failures, but a cohesive story, with ups and downs, yes, but in which everything played a role. The integration of the shadow is the step that allows this story to be fully accepted, without paralyzing regret or blind pride. This agreement is not signed with words, but with an internal feeling of, "It is complete." And according to Jung, there is a moment when this becomes palpable, when memories stop hurting, not that they turn into pleasant recollections, but they stop carrying the weight of judgment. The mistake ceases to be a stain and becomes merely an inevitable part of life's fabric. At that moment, the mind stops fighting the past, and death ceases to be a threat, because there is nothing left to run from. To help in this process, Jung proposed a type of personal closing ritual, not a religious ritual, but an individual practice of reconciliation. He suggested 3 central steps. First, bring to consciousness everything that still bothers you: stories, people, unspoken words. Second, express this in some way. Write a letter, even if it's never sent. Speak aloud, record it in audio or video. Third, transform it into something symbolic. Burn the letter, bury the paper, keep the recording in a specific place. The physical act helps the mind to perceive that it has been concluded. This ritual doesn't have to be done all at once. It can be repeated as many times as necessary until the feeling of completeness settles in. Many people discover in this process that there are still possible reconciliations with living people. A phone call, a meeting, or even a simple "I understand you" can dissolve decades of tension. And even when reconciliation with the other is not possible, the act of doing it internally already changes how we carry the memory. An important detail that Jung emphasized: don't wait to feel ready to do this. Readiness, he said, is an illusion. True preparation emerges during the act. Just as in the initial confrontation with the shadow, it is the movement that creates courage, not the other way around. And often, it is precisely when we feel least prepared that the greatest breakthroughs occur. Another aspect of this final preparation is what Jung called the acceptance of the luminous parts of the shadow. This might sound strange, but he reminded us that the shadow also contains talents, affections, and qualities that we stopped living. By integrating these parts, we can experience, even in our final years, an unexpected vitality. It's the elderly person who finally decides to paint, sing, write, or dedicate themselves to something they always wanted, not as a way to compensate for lost time, but as an affirmation that there is still life until the last day. This reunion with forgotten parts of oneself has an almost magical effect on the fear of death, because by allowing oneself to live fully now, even if for a short time, the feeling that something was missing diminishes. Jung saw this as the closing of a circle. We begin life as an indivisible whole, spend decades fragmenting ourselves, and the final work is to gather those parts before the farewell. There is also, in this process, a profound impact on relationships. When an elderly person begins to integrate their shadow, the way they relate to children, grandchildren, and friends changes. It becomes easier to apologize, simpler to express affection, lighter to talk about the end. This creates an atmosphere of serenity that infects those nearby. And this is perhaps the most important legacy one can leave, not just material possessions, but a memory of peace, authenticity, and reconciliation. Jung did not deny that physical death can bring pain and discomfort, but for him, the greater suffering comes from mental resistance, from not accepting. When the shadow is integrated, death transforms into something very close to an act of conscious surrender. And this surrender does not mean giving up, but understanding that life has fulfilled its purpose. It's like closing a book and feeling that all the pages that needed to be written are already there. This is the point where many people describe a radical change in the fear they felt. It's not that they stop fearing completely. After all, the unknown always brings uneasiness. But the fear ceases to be paralyzing and becomes merely a serene curiosity. What will it be like becomes a stronger question than what if. And this curiosity, according to Jung, is a sign that the shadow has ceased to govern the mind. Ultimately, Jung's final message to those reaching old age is both simple and hard. Don't wait for your deathbed to reconcile with yourself, because when time shortens, the shadow presents itself relentlessly, and there isn't always the energy or clarity to do the work. Starting now, even if it seems late, is the greatest act of care you can have for your own future. And to begin, you don't need to transform your entire life at once. Just a small gesture, noting an uncomfortable memory, revisiting a conversation you avoid, allowing yourself to feel something you always tried to silence. These gestures open space for the shadow to gradually reveal itself, and each revelation is a piece of weight being lifted from your shoulders. In the end, Jung's great revelation is that peace in death is not the result of luck, a perfect life, or religious belief. It is the fruit of conscious work of acceptance. It is recognizing that within us there is light and shadow, and that both are part of the same being. It is understanding that we are not defined by our worst moments, but by the ability to look at them and say, I accept that this is also me. When that moment arrives, death loses its threatening face. It becomes merely the last turn on a road we already know well. And as we take that turn, we don't just carry memories with us. We carry the wholeness of having been, until the very end, who we truly are. If this conversation resonated with you, if it somehow opened a new space in your way of thinking about aging and dying, consider supporting this work. Subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video with someone who might need this reflection. Because perhaps by planting this seed in another life, you are also helping to illuminate a shadow that never had the chance to be seen.